Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast, the first of 2024. Happy New Year. My name's Anthony Oliver, and today we will be taking a quick look into the crystal ball, asking what we might expect in 2024. To help me with this, my guest today is Gill Plimmer, infrastructure correspondent at the Financial Times and long-time observer of what makes this sector tick. Gill has spent several decades immersed in the business, finances and politics of infrastructure, writing about a range of issues over the years, including the rise and fall of PFI, the merits of water privatisation, outsourced services, including the collapse of Carillion and Interserve, rail franchising and the challenge of meeting house building targets. And much of this list will, I'm sure, return to the headlines over the next 12 months, alongside the inevitable rows and promises that accompany a general election. Much to discuss, so let's crack straight on. Gill, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast today.
Hi.
Well, Gill, set the scene for us today. How has 2023 been for you as an infrastructure correspondent? What sectors have really been commanding your attention?
Well, it was busy. The big story was the rise in inflation, which particularly affected construction material, labour and energy costs. And that had a massive impact on everything from water companies to rail projects, including the biggest, as you know, the new high-speed railway line HS2. Inflation has come down a bit, but it's still at historic highs, so it'll be incredibly interesting to see if it claims more casualties next year.
Right, yeah. It's certainly been an issue that most people in the major project sector have been discussing. And, I'm sure we're going to, as you say, we're going to continue to hear about that. But, we also continue to hear that investment in infrastructure is key to driving growth in the UK economy. We've got the National Infrastructure Commission's needs assessment making it clear that action is now urgent and that the government needs to make bold decisions, plan for long term. Given that the 60% or more of the current pipeline of investment will come from the private sector, are you sensing that this market has confidence in the policies that have to underpin this investment?
I'm really not sure that there is greater private sector confidence. There's big projects that are waiting to get the go-ahead this year, including the Lower Thames Crossing, a new 14-mile road and tunnel to the east of London. And although it's publicly funded, it should bring work to a host of private contractors. But in an election year, it's hard for the government to keep focused, and it's likely that that decision to give the go-ahead or not may get derailed and shunted forward to become the problem of the next government. And that is a problem overall with infrastructure, that although the government has created all these bodies, we now have a National Infrastructure Bank, and as you say, we have the National Infrastructure Commission. Very few of them really have power to make decisions quickly, and where they do, it tends not to be on the things that are needed. And a lot of these things are very unflashy. They're road maintenance projects and, water investment. And that's really where UK infrastructure is crumbling. And for private sector investors, they're seeing very attractive opportunities elsewhere.
Right, yeah.
Biden's Inflation Reduction Act has, brought huge opportunities for US investors. And I think the sort of ongoing political uncertainty that the UK has faced has probably caused them to look abroad more than the UK.
Well, I suppose that's it's an accurate, but I suppose it's a reasonably depressing kind of thought that that we are likely to miss out because of the attractiveness of other countries. But one of the things that the UK has been a pioneer in, of course, is the private finance initiative, getting private sector to align with public projects. But you wrote an interesting piece recently in the FT on the implications of the approaching end to many of these long-term contracts signed under the Labour government. Hospitals and schools. Do you think that's a brewing scandal for 2024? Tell us about the story, and how's it moved on?
Yes, well, I guess, the big thing is there's a huge number of PFI projects that are coming to an end. I think the NAO said 71 PFI contracts, which includes hospitals, schools and military bases, worth about $4 billion are coming to an end in the next 4 years. And that's been accompanied by a huge number of disputes as the local authorities and hospitals and state bodies prepare for handback. And it's one of those interesting things where, local authorities and hospitals are keen to get the best deal for taxpayers, and the private sector feels strongly that, contracts should also be honoured. So what we're seeing is some cases land up in the courts, and there's widespread expectations that we'll see even more land up in the courts next year.
I mean, you are expecting, that the number that are in dispute to start to sort of mushroom?
I think so. I mean, lots will be settled behind the scenes and won't make it into the public domain. And I think local authorities and private sector investors will be keen to see that happen. But there's some that just won't be able to keep a lid on things, and they will emerge in the courts over the next couple of years.
Well, I suppose the reality is that local authorities are under huge financial pressure. So, reclaiming as much cash as they can at this stage at the end of these PFI contracts, and making sure that they get the assets handed back in the right standard is going to be crucial. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. The establishment of the National Infrastructure Commission in 2015 has started to bring some structure to the UK's infrastructure planning. But it's interesting that Treasury recently vetoed publication of the latest construction projects pipeline that normally is published alongside the autumn statement in November. I mean, do you get the impression that the government commitment really matches this £805 billion or whatever it is pipeline of programmes that are aspired to?
I mean, I think the long-term problem has always been that the government is keen to announce projects, but it doesn't necessarily get them to that construction-ready stage. And it's a lot easier to make announcements than it is to actually deliver projects. And that will continue to be a problem, and it's going to be more of a problem this year, given that we're probably facing an election.
Yeah, well, we'll talk a bit more about planning a bit later on, because that's certainly hot in terms of topics going forward. But let's talk about energy transition first, and the potential government step back from the green agenda. The National Infrastructure Commission estimates that private sector investment of 20 to 35 billion per year is needed between 2025 and 2050. I mean, how do you see that challenge of translating, the wider strategies around, say, energy policy into the business models needed for developers to invest? You made the point earlier that, the international competition is hot. Do you see that those business models are being formulated by the UK to attract investment?
Well, I think one of the issues is that, the UK has, it's privatised its infrastructure, and some of that infrastructure just hasn't got ready in time for climate change. And there's really no excuse for that. I mean, wind and solar developers are all complaining that they're facing massive 10, 15-year wastes to connect to the national grid, for example, and yet the national grid just hasn't got capacity. And one of the issues is that it's, a large centralised system, and we need to move away from that. But that will take quite a lot of investment and will probably take quite a long time to deliver.
Right, yeah, but we are looking positive. We are making progress in renewable generation. We've got about 55 gigawatts of renewable capacity. But of course, the latest offshore wind CFD round, contracts for difference round, failed.
Yes.
I mean, is that kind of endemic, do you think, of the industry's reluctance to get involved, or is it just simply the result of government just getting the whole thing wrong?
Well, I mean, it's partly a result of tough competition from elsewhere. Renewable developers can now go to the US or Europe, both of which offer favourable terms. It's also true that they require subsidies or support from government. So none of these projects happen without the government, and that takes an incredible amount of action. So when we talk about private sector investment, it's not straightforwardly, in many cases, companies putting their hands into their pockets and saying, we will do this for you. It often requires the government de-risking the project substantially to make it attractive to private sector investors.
Yeah, COP28 is behind us, but we have heard Rishi Sunak, slowing down targets to meet the net zero objectives. I mean, do you think that's hindered the investment imperative?
I'm not sure it has. I mean, although like most people, I want to see the UK move to a renewable future, it's also true that some of those targets were unlikely to be met. And the UK remains dependent on oil and gas, unfortunately.
Well, if you look at the National Grid's dashboard, certainly gas is still reliably delivering about over half of the national demand. But of course, we're in an election year. What might an incoming Labour government do to change that kind of investment profile? I mean, they're talking about being net zero by 2030 now, I think, are they, Labour? I mean, is that realistic? I mean, what might they be able to do?
Well, they had promised to back a whole lot of renewable investment, but they seem to be watering down those promises, and it will be interesting to see if they tighten up their pledges and what they actually offer investors.
Well, certainly planning, I imagine, will be one of the areas which, any government going forward is going to have to start tackling. We heard on the last podcast of the year with Julia Prescott, I mean, her evidence to the Common Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee, it was really focused on planning and the challenge of overcoming, the point you made earlier, connection delays, which is really holding back the investment, and moved from, I think it's something like 2.6 years to about 4.2 years now.
I think it's even longer in some cases.
Yeah. Well, I mean, imagine that problem is going to continue to hold back investment, hold back incentives for the private sector to get involved.
Yes, indeed.
Is that the critical area then?
I think that's one of the big critical areas, for sure, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I also talked to Julia about the Select Committee Chair Angus Brendan McNeil's view that the constraints payment, the money paid to generators if the grid can't take their output, would soon be a national scandal. I mean, it can't be about 600 million, could reach 3 billion in the next 5 years if we don't get this planning sorted out and the connections sorted out. Is it likely to be on the FT's news or investigation list?
One would hope so. We have an entire energy team, though,
right,
focused on such issues. So, one would hope that would be a key area for investigation. I mean, I think the trouble with planning is, it's two-pronged, isn't it? So if you look at the Lower Thames crossing, for example, it's had massive planning issues, and in fact, it's taken years just to get to where it is, waiting for approval. But it is a delicate balance between sort of giving developers free range and protecting local residents' rights. And I'm always slightly reluctant to join the sort of anti-NIMBY pro-developer campaign.
Right. Yeah, I mean, planning has a purpose. It's there to
Yes, exactly. I mean, infrastructure projects take a long time to deliver in the UK, partly because there are tight planning procedures. You don't necessarily have that in China. But on the other hand, that is the price of democracy, and it can be seen as a good thing.
Yeah. I suppose moving from planning to perhaps talk about another area which is certainly generating a lot of public opinion and a lot of public distress, and that's the water sector. Much has been said and written about the impact of water privatisation, not least by the FT. I mean, most recently, the reality is that water companies, they are still polluting rivers and beaches regularly, and in some cases, as I think you've written, hiding it. It's linked to the amount of flooding that we're seeing and the ageing networks that they're operating. But, we have seen also high levels of private sector investment, perhaps beyond the level that the public sector would have afforded. I mean, what are you going to be writing about in terms of water in 2024?
Well, I think we need to look at exactly what we're talking about when we talk about private sector investment. I mean, essentially, the water companies were privatised in 1989 with almost no debt. Since then, they've raised more than 60 billion debt, which we are now paying for through our bills. And actually very little equity has ever been put in by the investors and owners into the companies and the infrastructure. Most of the most of the spending on maintenance and capital investment in infrastructure has come from consumer bills and from the debt, which we also pay for. So it's an important distinction, I think.
So is that a regulation failure, or is it a wider industry system failure?
Well, I think clearly the initial system was set up with the idea that companies would borrow to invest. So to some extent, the privatisation was based on that debt-based model. But the issue is that now they have too much debt. Inflation has increased costs, particularly for energy, and they're big users of energy and chemicals and also labour. And now many of them are struggling under the weight of that debt. And that is reducing the amount that's available for investment. And there's a long legacy of underinvestment, and Ofwat, the regulator, has traditionally seen its role as simply monitoring the finances of the companies, but essentially taken the view that it was up to them to manage their businesses. And, now it's sort of chickens coming home to roost time, and we have the possibility of Thames Water, parent company at least, collapsing this year. It remains to be seen whether the investors will actually stump up some equity into the business.
Well, certainly that's one to look out for, and certainly also one to see what the regulator actually, what action they can take on that. I
mean, the real question is how much Ofwat will allow water bills to increase. And Thames, for example, has asked for a 40% increase in water bills by 2030. That's before the impact of inflation. And that's going to be difficult for consumers, which are already facing a cost of living crisis. So for Ofwat, it's going to be a very difficult year, sort of trying to balance the needs of the water companies and the investors that own them and the needs of consumers.
As I say, clearly something to look out for and follow over 2024. Another thing to really keep an eye out, I imagine, will be the more big report, the post-Grenfell inquiry report. It's a story which I'm sure will be on your pages as the report comes out sometime we're here in 2024. I mean, clearly the fallout from the Grenfell tragedy, fire tragedy, it's only just begun. I mean, how do you see those issues?
Well, there was an earlier report which sort of traced many of the problems to the way that the construction industry is set up in the UK, and the sort of fragmentation and the number of contractors and lawyers and managers on every project. So at Grenfell, I think it was described as a system failure. It was prioritising kind of quick and cheap over good and safe. I think that's true, and with no one actually taking responsibility for the overall project. Everything was divided up. There were legal agreements as to who would do which bit of the work. And really that left no one taking full responsibility for the problems that later emerged, or the tragedy that later emerged, as I should say.
Yeah. Well, the focus of blame has rightly been pointed towards a number of businesses and individuals taking shortcuts, to make ends meet. But, I mean, the case, it surely highlights to me wider fundamental problems in the sector, driven by a culture of value engineering, cost cutting, low margins. I mean, is a reset possible?
It's hard to see how it would happen, but I agree it needs to happen. These are some of the same problems that, faced many of the subcontractors to Carillion. We've seen it with Interserve. I mean, the sort of fragmented UK construction industry is constantly on its toes, I guess.
Well, I'm currently working with specialist broker risk manager at Griffiths and Armour to help the construction professionals navigate the changing world of risk management and professional indemnity insurance. There'll be a podcast on that in January, by the way. We've seen the insurance market harden dramatically in the face of rising claims, widening risk profiles, not least driven by the report you referred to, the Dame Judith Hackett's post-Grenfell report. How do you see that panning out? Are small specialist businesses going to fold? Is more consolidation on the cards?
Well, I think we saw a lot of construction insolvencies last year. I think it was a record since the financial crisis, partly driven by those inflationary pressures we talked about before, and also the slowdown in house building, as well as the delays to government infrastructure projects. One can only hope that those bankruptcies may slow down this year.
Well, we'll see, but certainly there's increasing pressure on all of those. Gill, let's talk a bit about you. I mean, you're originally from New Zealand.
Yeah.
I mean, how did you end up in London writing for the FT and writing about infrastructure? What's your story then?
I like infrastructure. I catch the train from Blackfriars every morning and I look at this beautiful station, and I think, within the FT, there's a lot of people writing about finance, but infrastructure is actually very real and concrete. And I like that about it.
Okay. I mean, FT is clearly a market-moving publication. I mean, what's the FT process for story gathering? I mean, what does an average day in your world look like?
I guess, we'd start at 7, sort of looking for stock market announcements that may need writing up. Interestingly, the focus on them has slightly shifted over the past few years. I think readers don't pay quite the attention to them that they used to. And now, of course, we have more metrics. The FT can literally track how many viewers every story gets, how long their eyeballs stay on the page, and so forth.
Oh, right.
So there's a real premium on scoops as much as stock market announcements. But nevertheless, if there is a strong one, we have to write it up. And then, later in the day, we pitch stories, and sometimes we get asked to write stories. And we'll also have longer running projects that we're working on, bits of analysis, colour pieces, and so forth.
I mean, you say there's a lot of metrics around eyeballs. I mean, how popular is infrastructure as a sector in terms of your readership?
It is popular, yeah. I think energy and infrastructure stories are always crucial and get lots of readers. I mean, some of the big stories, which, if you managed to include the word Brexit over the past few years, that would have upped your readership count. But infrastructure stories do tend to play well. And lately, of course, there's been a lot of interest in HS2 and water. Yeah. And they have also got lots of readers.
Yeah. You must meet and chat to a lot of business leaders in your job. I mean, what would you say makes the best leaders? What are their character traits that makes them really successful or not?
Well, as a journalist, I obviously love leaders that, speak plainly and clearly and give accurate accounts of their business. There's a lot of waffle in business journalism and in business talk. And anyone who can speak straightforwardly about the problems faced by the industry and their company gets a high rating in my book.
Well, which is a nice segue perhaps to talk about the rail sector, because one such business leader, Network Rail's chief exec Andrew Haynes, I mean, he took to social media last year, the end of last year, following the rush hour failure of overhead cables and trains out of Paddington. He said, we failed as a system, we've gone backwards on customer service, and given he was caught up in the chaos, he added, I intend to use my own painful experience in committing to improve how we deliver for our customers and support our colleagues. Is that the kind of plain speaking honesty that you would say sets out leaders in the sector?
I mean, I guess what would really set him out is if he managed to deliver that change. But I think all CEOs can talk like that, especially if they get caught up in a crisis. The difference is being able to deliver, isn't it? And it seems staggering to me that, a couple of decades after I arrived in this country, even getting proper communication when your train is delayed or stuck still seems almost impossible. Right. Much less actually fixing the problem and making sure that trains aren't stuck.
Well, there's lots of ideas about how to fix it, one of which, of course, is Great British Railways. Is that the solution? What are you hearing about that? Where are we? Obviously, we need some legislation, but where are we? Is it the solution for you?
I guess it could be. It's just, it makes sense to have a sort of state-owned public body that oversees it all. But it really just depends how it pans out. All these things are often quite good in theory. But actually, Transport for London provides very good train services. It's possible that localisation is another way of delivering good services. I mean, I guess one issue is that although it's a public body, it still retains franchises to run the services, and it would contract private sector companies to run the services. I mean, I think it's a fair question to ask at this point whether that's the right thing to do. I mean, it's sort of hard to know what these franchises deliver. Many of them are provided by other state-owned national operators, the French, the Germans, the Italians, and they use the existing staff and management. And, it's quite hard to know what additional benefit these private operators bring to the rail service, whether Great British Railways should just actually take over the management itself. Of course, it'll be localised, regionalised, but, whether it's not better just to employ the staff itself rather than going through a sort of, intermediary company.
No, well, vertical integration of the railways is the goal, I think, but that will, GBR transition team is adamant that the private sector has to be involved.
Yes, exactly. But I think public opinion shows that, most of the public actually support state-run railways at this point.
Yeah. Well, we've got a draft rail reform bill, promised in the King's speech. That doesn't necessarily mean we're going to get towards the necessary legislation to actually deliver Great British Railways. I mean, are you feeling positive about the rail sector going forward then? I mean, things are changing. Does that fill you with confidence?
I think it's just hard to know how it will pan out. We have a potential change of government. The truth is always in the delivery, isn't it? So, and as you say, many of these are draft plans yet to be agreed. At the moment, rail services aren't good. They're poor compared to other countries. And there's quite a lot to catch up with. I mean, they're also super expensive, aren't they? It's sort of mad to be talking about climate change goals when, it's actually sometimes cheaper to fly to Edinburgh than it is to catch a train.
Yeah, particularly if you've got more than one person,
Yeah.
One of the other big issues that we're probably going to be talking about is the skills needed to actually deliver some of this infrastructure aspiration. And there's a huge amount of discussion and argument right now about immigration, legal and illegal. But of course, the irony is that post-Brexit, across all sectors, there's huge gaps in the skills needed to drive the economy. Not least in infrastructure. I mean, do you see that changing? More infrastructure-related occupations perhaps being put on the needed list.
Well, it would be good if they were. I totally agree, because clearly construction also faces an exodus of older people, and that means there's a massive industry skills gap. And as you say, the exodus of EU workers following Brexit has further depleted the labour pool. So yes, that's a crucial issue. I mean, it's interesting that initiatives such as the high-speed rail training schools more or less didn't work. I think that was closed earlier this year. So there's clearly quite a need for thinking about how Britain trains new construction workers, and yes, welcoming immigrants that can work in the sector.
But of course, the other thing which we are also seeing is huge pressure on public services and housing. That is at the heart of the public and political debate over immigration. Do you see government of any colour ramping up the pressure on house builders to build more and build better?
Well, they may talk about it, but as we know, house builders are sitting on quite a lot of land which could be developed. the real trouble, as I see it, is a housing affordability crisis. So, although luxury apartments are being built near my work in Southwark, and, as we can see along the Thames near Battersea and so forth, the real issue is that there just isn't enough affordable housing. And I haven't seen any real plans to address that issue.
Okay. Finally, let's building on that about the delivery, because it is all about what happens next. And I discussed with National Infrastructure Commission Chief Executive James Heath recently, this whole issue of what happens next. One recommendation that they make is about removing barriers and accelerating decisions. I mean, certainly there is confusion and there's a lack of joined up policy that investors and developers are complaining about. I mean, should we be concerned about the ability of this government or any government to tackle these very, very difficult and complex infrastructure issues?
I think we probably should, shouldn't we? I mean, I think, the latest headlines just this week are about, hospitals being overcrowded. There's been, and the government has acknowledged, an increase in potholes. There's sort of infrastructure failings across the board, I think, are becoming more serious in the UK, and whichever government comes into power really needs to address them.
And I suppose we haven't really talked about HS2 because what more is there to say really? But I mean that maybe kind of highlights some of the big structural problems that we have in this country in terms of getting that kind of project or committing to those sort of major projects.
True, although I also think one of the issues with the UK is it's keen on those big projects, but, what the evidence really shows is that we need simple services that just get us back to work, to work and back. We need, better connections within cities as well as between cities. And we just need services to work properly.
And I suppose finally, with an election coming, I mean, it's unlikely that infrastructure is really going to feature hugely on the hustings. It just doesn't. It doesn't really cut it above the National Health Service. It doesn't really cut it above the cost of living crisis. Does that matter? Should it matter?
Well, I mean, you can say that, but in a way it depends at what you look at. So I know the Liberal Democrats, for example, say that water pollution issues are, earning as much attention on the doorstep as health issues at the moment. So infrastructure overall may not gain the headlines, but I think parts of it will be drawing voters' attention. And here, as the infrastructure correspondent at the FT, obviously, I would say it should command attention.
Well, no, but you're always going to be writing about flooding every year, a couple of times a year. More and more you're going to be writing about flooding, I imagine. It
looks like it, doesn't it? Even this week.
Exactly. Well, look, Gill, a very interesting year ahead. Certainly much for you to write about, and I'm sure plenty of scandals for you to unearth. Are you looking forward to it? Are you getting excited about 2024?
It's going to be busy, I think.
Well, election busy or just busy full stop?
I think busy full stop, but election busy too.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining me today on the Infrastructure Podcast. Certainly, it will be good to keep an eye on what you're writing about. Gill, thanks very much for joining me on the Infrastructure Podcast today.
Thanks so much, Anthony.
Well, Gill, that's all we've got time for today. But we've got more from the Infrastructure Podcast in the pipeline for 2024 and more guests to talk to as we continue to probe the big issues faced across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website. That's www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you will find background information and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us today. Thanks again to Gill. I look forward to seeing you again very soon.